Imagine inventing something so terrifying that within just a few years, nations across the globe agreed. Absolutely not. That's the story of the Dum Dum Bullet. Important note, the 1899 Prohibition only applied to wars between states that signed the Declaration. Police and civilian use today fall under a completely different legal framework. Born in India, banned at the Hague, and still debated in military ethics classrooms. It's a weapon whose reputation has lasted longer than the empire that built it. And yet, bullets with a strikingly similar design are standard issue for police in 2025. The key lies in both the technical resemblance and the legal distinction, a difference this story will unpack step by step. But before that, there's one odd detail about these bullets that people notice first: their name. The arsenal with the candy name. The story begins with an arsenal in British India, an ordinary supply depot that would eventually lend its name to one of the most infamous munitions in modern history. Known as the Dum Dum Arsenal, situated near Kolkata, it became the site where British military engineers tried to solve a pressing problem with the new .303 rifle cartridge. And while versions of expanding ammunition already existed, in hunting rifles and in older soft-lead bullets that deformed on impact, the Dum Dum adaptation was specific, a modified form of the full metal jacket service round designed for colonial campaigns. Its place of origin gave it a name that would carry far beyond the factory grounds, permanently attaching a disarmingly innocent label to a profoundly brutal weapon. The arsenal at Dum Dum had been a large-scale industrial hub of empire, producing cartridges, rifles, and everything Britain needed to arm its forces across the subcontinent. By the late 1800s, it was under huge pressure to meet military demands as the empire shifted towards small-caliber, high-velocity ammunition. On paper, these new rounds looked effective, fast, aerodynamic, and accurate at long range. But reports from the field soon revealed something troubling. The bullets were piercing enemies cleanly, leaving slim wounds that often didn't disable their targets right away. An opponent could be struck multiple times yet still keep advancing, a problem officers described with growing alarm. The rounds might have been admired in engineering reports, but on campaign their usefulness seemed uncertain at best and dangerous at worst. This was not a trivial issue for soldiers on the ground. In colonial theaters from Africa to Asia, firefights often happened at close quarters against fighters who were determined and highly mobile. When a bullet zipped through without producing instant results, it left British troops vulnerable. What the army wanted was not just precision, it wanted what soldiers soon began calling stopping power, the ability to end a charge in an instant. The Dum Dum arsenal became the place where that demand was taken seriously, and where a practical, if grim, solution was put into motion. The adjustments made there were not complicated. Captain Neville Clay, one of the ordnance officers at the factory, oversaw experiments on the .303 cartridge then in service. The standard version was a full metal jacket round designed to maintain its shape at high speed. Clay and his colleagues altered this design by cutting away or thinning the tip of the jacket, exposing the soft lead core underneath. The change was small, but its consequences were dramatic. On impact, the nose of the bullet no longer remained sleek. Instead, the lead spread out or mushroomed, carving a much wider wound channel than the narrow puncture left by the original. A soldier firing this round saw the effect immediately. An enemy once able to rush forward despite hits could now be stopped cold. Descriptions from observers often skipped the medical detail and focused squarely on outcomes. Where earlier bullets slipped through a body leaving an opponent disturbingly capable of fighting back, the Dum Dum variant shattered tissue and bone to such an extent that continuing the charge became impossible. For officers in the field, this was the solution they had been demanding. A rifleman armed with the new expanding rounds could fire fewer shots, but expect decisive result. The battlefield dynamic shifted, but so too did the moral and political questions surrounding this innovation. The curious part was how casually destructive power carried such a frivolous name. Dum Dum Bullet sounded, to English ears, like something pulled from a nursery rhyme. Soldiers used it informally at first, with little sense that the nickname itself might one day eclipse the technical designations like Mark Roman II** or Mark IV. Colonial administrators requested shipments of Dum Dums, as if the word referred to nothing more serious than a standardized bit of equipment. Yet behind the euphemistic language were battlefield injuries of shocking severity. Accounts told of massive wounds emergency amputations, and opponents incapacitated in ways far more catastrophic than before. The childlike sound of the name served only to highlight the grim mismatch between word and effect. It is important to remember that Dum Dum's expanding rounds were not the first of their kind. Hunters had long relied on hollow point and soft-lead bullets to stop large game, and earlier designs like the Mini-A ball deformed significantly on impact. What made Dum Dum different was its place within the official supply chain of an imperial army, a sanctioned modification brought into service not for sport, but as an organized response to battlefield conditions. That institutional backing gave the bullet legitimacy in the eyes of commanders, and later, notoriety in the eyes of critics. The broader context reveals an uncomfortable truth about how empires operated. The design produced at Dum Dum was not simply technical problem-solving, it was a weapon tailored for colonial control. Against populations viewed as needing firm suppression, British forces demanded ammunition capable of asserting overwhelming force quickly and visibly. The expanding bullet delivered exactly that. For the men firing it, the reassurance was tangible. For those struck by it, the consequence was a level of injury often beyond recovery. In that balance of needs and outcomes, Dum Dum became an emblem of the raw violence that underpinned imperial expansion. Over time, the arsenal itself faded from memory, but the name endured. Dum Dum came to mean any expanding bullet, whether or not it had been made at Kolkata. Journalists, diplomats, and soldiers all adopted the term until it signified not a factory but a category of brutality. Reports from battle fronts spread beyond military circles into public commentary, where critics seized on the phrase as evidence of warfare that had crossed into unacceptable territory. What began as a technical fix at a single arsenal had transformed into the symbol of a global debate over the limits of allowable violence. One final irony made the term unforgettable. Had the experiment been conducted at Enfield or Woolwich, the resulting ammunition might have been known by a bland ordnance designation. Instead, it bore a name that sounded more like confectionery than weaponry. The contrast between sound and substance fixed the idea in public imagination. By the late 1890s, Dum Dum had become shorthand for cruelty on the battlefield, a word that carried not just technical meaning but moral weight. It was instantly recognizable, lingering in discussions of military ethics long after the colonial depot itself had lost its relevance. For the engineers who first tried the modification, none of this was their intention. Their task had been straightforward: make sure the .303 round could bring down an adversary swiftly and reliably. But in solving that immediate problem, they had sparked a controversy that would ripple far beyond their workshop. To Britain's army, it offered a fix. To the outside world, it represented a disturbing example of technology surpassing the boundaries of acceptable use. The next stage of the story would not be centered on the arsenal, but on the battlefield problem itself. What commanders really meant when they spoke obsessively of stopping power, and why the Dum Dum was seen as its answer. Stopping power and the battlefield problem. When the British Army adopted smaller, high-velocity rifle rounds in the late 19th century, the change was hailed as modernization. These cartridges were flatter in trajectory, more precise over long distances, and easier to mass-produce than the old lead balls. But the apparent advantage quickly revealed a serious drawback. Reports from the field described enemies being struck cleanly yet continuing to advance, sometimes even after several hits. For soldiers in remote garrisons, watching opponents close the gap despite well-aimed fire was unnerving. The technical cause was not mysterious. The new bullets were encased in a copper or brass shell, the full metal jacket. This jacket was introduced for a reason. Smokeless powder, far hotter and more corrosive than black powder, had been destroying lead bullets and fouling barrels. The jacket solved that problem, allowing high-speed firing without ruining rifles. But the same feature that kept the bore clean also kept the round intact after impact. Instead of fragmenting or deforming like soft lead, the bullet passed straight through the body while holding its shape, leaving wounds that looked deceptively small. In practice, this meant a chest shot might fail to stop a charge if it missed the heart or spine by even a narrow margin. One vivid example appeared again and again in memories of British frontier campaigns. Soldiers firing their new Lee Metford rifles at fast-moving opponents would see men falter only slightly, then continue forward with blades or rifles raised. To the troops themselves, the marksmanship was not in question. The weapon was simply failing its most important test. In a close fight, a bullet that pierced cleanly without halting the advance was worse than useless. It was a hazard to the shooter relying on it. Commanders framed this problem in a new vocabulary. They spoke not of accuracy, but of stopping power, meaning a round's ability to halt a person on the spot. Older soft-lead ammunition performed this function naturally, since it crushed and deformed inside the body. By contrast, the full metal jacket worked too well in preserving its streamlined form. From Sudan to the northwest frontier, reports from Chitral, Malakand, and later Omdurman repeated the complaint. The .303 service round produced neat holes, but not enough shock to incapacitate at once. For officers who measured survival by whether a single shot could halt a charge, this was a bitter irony. To understand why this priority weighed so heavily, consider the math of small colonial units. A handful of British riflemen holding a defensive position might face dozens of attackers rushing across open ground. Ammunition was limited, reloads took time, and reinforcements might be miles away. If each bullet disabled a man immediately, that handful of riflemen could hold their line. But when bullets passed through without knocking men down, the attackers could still press forward, sometimes reaching bayonet range. In such environments, what the army demanded was not just accuracy, but certainty. At Dum Dum Arsenal, engineers were tasked with solving that dilemma. The modifications they introduced were straightforward but decisive. By trimming back the forward part of the copper jacket or leaving the nose unjacketed altogether, they exposed the softer lead core inside. When this round struck flesh, the lead expanded outward, increasing its diameter and tearing a much broader path. Instead of slipping cleanly through, it crushed tissue and splintered bone. In plain terms, the bullet was designed to deform, and in doing so it delivered the immediate collapse commanders had been asking for. Field reports soon confirmed the change in effect. Where soldiers once worried at the sight of opponents pressing on despite multiple hits, they now saw enemies drop after a single shot. To British officers, this felt like vindication. The rifle's full potential had been unlocked. To those struck, it meant catastrophic injuries even from hits to limbs. A wound no longer looked like a small puncture. Instead, it resembled torn meat, with damage so extensive that survival often required amputation, if survival was possible at all. What had been sold as a correction to a design flaw came at the cost of injuries so severe they unnerved even experienced observers. On the battlefield, the difference was blunt and unmistakable. Troops armed with standard jacketed rounds sometimes risked being overrun by men who stayed on their feet after several hits. With dum-dums, the charge could be broken by fewer shots. In terms of tactical advantage, the choice seemed self-evident, but the very efficiency of this ammunition gave rise to unease. Unlike the tidy wounds of the earlier .303, which surgeons might patch with stitching or bandaging, these new injuries were devastating by default. Even minor hits destroyed limbs beyond repair. For British officers, the answer to the question of whether the bullets were acceptable was straightforward. They worked, and therefore they were necessary. Effectiveness carried greater weight than humanitarian concern. Yet soldiers returning from campaigns wrote about what they had witnessed, from bodies struck down instantly to wounds so graphic they barely resembled what medical staff had prepared for. These stories spread until the Dum Dum Bullet was known not just as a solution to a tactical issue, but as a symbol of excessive violence, a round designed to guarantee destruction beyond what many considered tolerable. That tension, the demand for certainty in combat, and the horror of the results, was not something the engineers at Dum Dum could resolve. Their bullets answered the Army's plea for stopping power, but they also left behind scenes that created new doubts about how far technology should go. Those doubts did not surface in parliamentary debates or military memoranda alone. They were inscribed in the bodies treated by field surgeons, who suddenly confronted wounds that bore little resemblance to those they had been trained for. And it was in those medical tents and hospitals that the full consequences became visible, revealing the true costs of these expanding rounds in ways no tactical report could prepare for. Battlefield shockwaves. On the battlefield, the first encounters with dum-dum wounds struck both soldiers and doctors with a kind of disbelief. Earlier forms of ammunition had left injuries that were painful and dangerous, but at least carried the possibility of treatment. A round musket ball or a standard full metal jacket might fracture a bone or pierce an organ, yet surgeons recognized the patterns and had established methods, cleaning, stitching, and setting breaks. With dum-dums, that sense of familiarity collapsed. The damage exceeded anything doctors of the 19th century had prepared for. Wounds often appeared as gaping cavities rather than linear tracks, and in many cases the destruction was so extensive that survival hinged on immediate amputation. What made these bullets so disruptive was the way they behaved upon impact. The exposed lead at the tip caused the bullet to deform the moment it hit resistance. Instead of passing forward smoothly, the nose flattened outward, pushing tissue violently aside. Each millimeter of widening increased the trauma, carving misshapen channels and leaving behind jagged wounds. A thigh or arm hit squarely could look as though it had been torn apart rather than pierced, with surgeons reporting shattered long bones that broke into sharp splinters. Compared with the cleaner punctures of traditional ammunition, the difference was obvious to anyone who saw it, and horrifying for those tasked with treatment. Medical reports from campaigns of the 1890s, especially those compiled by field surgeons at Omdurman in Sudan, drew particular attention. Their notes described shattered femurs, pulverized shoulders, and exit wounds that appeared several times larger than the entry point. Many of these cases ended in amputation right on the operating table, not as a last resort, but as the only avenue for survival. For doctors who had grown accustomed to cleaner bullet wounds, even in crude battlefield conditions, dum-dums seemed less like conventional ammunition and more like instruments designed to maximize destruction. The psychological effect spread quickly beyond operating tents. Soldiers who heard accounts of these wounds or who saw comrades coming back disfigured began to fear not only death but the likelihood of mutilation. Being struck no longer meant a chance at recovery. It often meant permanent disability even if one lived. Within ranks, the mere rumor that opposing forces used expanding bullets raised dread, making the weapon infamous long before official debates began. For commanders, such results demonstrated the sought-after stopping power. For surgeons and soldiers, the same results embodied an entirely new scale of cruelty. Even hardened military doctors, accustomed to grim scenes, admitted they had never confronted injuries quite like these. Setting bones became pointless when what remained were shards beyond reconstruction. Repairing flesh was futile when arteries and ligaments had been shredded into uneven fragments. The line between battlefield necessity and medical futility was drawn into stark relief. Officers emphasized the weapon's effectiveness in halting charges. Medical personnel recoiled at the futility of their work when confronted with mangled limbs. The tension stood as a reminder that the same design praised in tactical terms could be condemned as barbaric in medical ones. Drawings and diagrams circulated in medical journals tried to capture the uniqueness of these wounds. Earlier illustrations of bullet injuries often resembled tidy punctures, clinical and manageable in appearance. With dum-dums, sketches showed gaping cavities, jagged edges, and missing sections of tissue. Observers remarked that exit wounds looked more like the result of explosive force than of a rifle bullet. To the eye of both soldier and surgeon, these were unmistakably different. Injuries that carried the impression of an intent to maim far beyond what was considered necessary in combat. For the wider army, such details were not abstract. Men in the line quickly realized what these new rounds meant for survival. A shot to the arm could result in amputation within days. A hit to the torso was nearly always fatal. The expanding bullets shifted perception of battle wounds from difficult to hopeless. This knowledge spread informally across units, reinforcing the dum-dum's notoriety as not simply a weapon of war, but a weapon of terror. At the same time, commanders viewed those very effects as vindication. The Standard Point 303 had too often passed through enemies without halting an assault. The dum-dum changed that equation. One shot could reliably drop an opponent, granting the tactical certainty they had demanded since the adoption of smokeless powder rifles. For them, the question seemed settled. The bullet achieved the job. But in hospitals and aid posts, where the injuries were opened and examined, the conclusion was starkly different. The technology was effective on the battlefield, but deeply troubling to those who had to face its consequences up close. For all its efficiency, the dum-dum forced a debate that went beyond military engineering. Was it acceptable to field a weapon so destructive that survival was often impossible even when the target had not been killed outright? Could one justify a round that so consistently produced amputations as its baseline medical outcome? These questions began as murmurs among surgeons and officers, but they grew louder as reports spread through newspapers and diplomatic channels. What had begun as a factory modification in colonial India now carried moral repercussions far outside the empire. Dum Dum's infamy did not come solely from colonial battlefields. It arose from a broader realization. In trying to solve a problem of combat effectiveness, the British Army had created a new kind of injury that struck many observers as excessive. To its users, the bullet restored confidence in their rifles. To its critics, it blurred the line between combat necessity and cruelty. That duality, military reassurance versus medical horror, gave the Dum Dum an extraordinary symbolic weight. It was not only a piece of ammunition. It became a test case for whether the pursuit of stopping power justified the cost in human suffering. By the end of the decade, this dispute was no longer confined to soldiers and doctors. Political leadership and international observers were taking notice. Reports of wounds from places like Omdurman bolstered a growing sense that the expanding bullet represented a departure from accepted limits of warfare. Debates began to move from regimental mess halls and medical journals into diplomatic chambers. And soon, the question would not only be what the Dum Dum did to the human body, but whether the world's leading powers were willing to accept such a weapon as compatible with the rules of civilized war. It was in that climate of concern, where battlefield necessity clashed with deepening unease, that governments prepared to meet face to face and draw the boundaries of acceptable violence. The Hague Convention, drawing the line. In 1899, representatives from the world's leading powers convened in The Hague, a Dutch city that was quickly becoming synonymous with international diplomacy. Their aim was not to debate loosely defined ideals, but to place distinct limits on how wars should be fought in an age of increasingly destructive weapons. Military innovation in the late 19th century had reshaped combat. Smokeless powder, repeating rifles, and improved artillery had made battle faster and deadlier, raising questions about whether any boundaries remained between acceptable military practice and outright cruelty. The Hague Peace Conference set out to mark those boundaries with new rules. Among the questions laid before the delegates was the status of expanding bullets, a subject that triggered sharp disagreement as soon as it appeared on the agenda. The British delegation carried the heaviest burden in this debate. Their army had officially fielded Dum Dum bullets in colonial campaigns and continued to regard them as indispensable. Military officers argued that enemies often advanced despite wounds from standard full metal jacket ammunition. To them, Dum Dums solved the problem of insufficient stopping power. They emphasized that these bullets were not explosive, but rather simple modifications necessary for survival in certain battle conditions. And so, in the ornate chambers of The Hague, British diplomats defended a weapon their soldiers already relied on. Across the table, other powers reacted with skepticism and outrage. Delegates from continental Europe referred to battlefield reports documenting shattered bones and massive tissue destruction. To them, these injuries exceeded what could be considered ordinary battlefield harm. They argued that such ammunition inflicted unnecessary suffering, a core standard that international law had already started to consider. Their position was clear. Expanding bullets went too far, weaponizing pain and mutilation rather than focusing on the act of neutralizing an enemy. This was not the first time that nations had attempted to regulate the effects of munitions. More than 3 decades earlier, the 1868 St. Petersburg Declaration had outlawed explosive projectiles under 400 grams on the grounds that they caused excessive injuries without significantly impacting the outcome of battle. That earlier treaty had set a legal and moral precedent. Some designs were too destructive to be legitimized in modern war. The appearance of Dum Dum bullets at The Hague fit into that evolving framework, extending the conversation about how far weapon design could go without crossing the threshold into cruelty. Debates at the conference tended to distill into 2 opposing positions, easily summarized. One side argued that Dum Dum bullets caused unnecessary suffering, producing catastrophic injuries that medical officers themselves declared irreversible without drastic intervention. The other side, chiefly Britain's representatives, maintained that such rounds were justified by the unique conditions of colonial combat and emphasized again that they were not explosive and therefore outside the earlier St. Petersburg restrictions. These exchanges framed dum-dums not simply as a weapon, but as a test case for the future of humanitarian law in war. The conference's final action was a resolution known as Declaration III. It committed contracting powers to abstain from the use of bullets which expand or flatten easily in the human body. This language captured dum-dums directly, grouping them with any future ammunition of similar design. Legal precision mattered here. The declaration did not ban expanding rounds outright in all wars, nor did it bind every nation present. Some major powers, including the United States, did not sign or ratify it at the time. Still, for those who did, the agreement established a shared commitment that these bullets had crossed the line into unacceptable warfare. Britain accepted the declaration, though the decision carried frustration. Diplomats recognized that opposing the measure outright would cost valuable credibility at a conference designed to promote cooperation. To save face, British officials drew a subtle distinction in their interpretation. They accepted the rule as binding in wars between European powers, but reserved flexibility elsewhere. This reasoning left space, at least unofficially, for continued use in colonial conflicts. The Hague had created a restrictive rule, yet one already marked by exceptions and selective enforcement. Seen against the wars that would follow, the declaration stands out in both importance and irony. Just 15 years later, the First World War would unleash poison gas on battlefields, inflict mass civilian bombardment, and normalize industrial-scale destruction. Acts the Hague rules had not effectively anticipated or outlawed. In retrospect, the Dum Dum Bullet appeared modest by comparison, a small-caliber round singled out in an era that would soon witness far broader atrocity. Yet precisely because it was regulated early, it became one of the clearest markers of an international effort to restrain the means of war. That symbolism explains why dum-dums retain their notoriety. The name of a colonial arsenal near Kolkata had transformed into shorthand for unacceptable violence. Out of the many tools designed for battle, it was a bullet with a deceptively benign-sounding name that drew universal condemnation at The Hague. Nations used the debate to project an image of themselves as civilized powers operating within rule. To align with the ban was to claim a role not merely as a military force, but as an actor committed to the evolving framework of humanitarian conduct. It should not be overlooked that these discussions played out in rarefied settings, far removed from the soldiers in trenches or the surgeons tending wounded bodies. The diplomats spoke in abstractions about what war ought to be, while actual battlefields were already shaped by the weapons they condemned. Still, the legal line they drew mattered. For the first time, expanding bullets were identified under international law as weapons that inflicted suffering disproportionate to their military purpose. That principle, measuring not only what a weapon could achieve, but the misery it caused, became a template for later arms restrictions. Although dum-dum bullets themselves had a brief active life before being outlawed by treaty, the controversy surrounding them had lasting consequences. They set a precedent for the idea that weapon design could be deemed unacceptable regardless of battlefield efficiency. A projectile small enough to fit in the palm of the hand forced governments to rethink the terms of civilized warfare and codify restrictions that stretched beyond practical military concern. From that moment on, the question of what a weapon did to the human body became part of international law. Yet one final irony endured. Of all the devastating technologies on the horizon, machine guns, heavy artillery, chemical gases, it was the dum-dum that first attracted explicit prohibition. A round with a childlike name became the first bullet formally judged as too cruel for use between modern states. By highlighting its design and effects, diplomats turned it into a symbol of restraint, a line in the sand, even if future wars would often overrun such boundaries with worse horrors. And while its notoriety was secured in diplomatic texts and legal definitions, its practical use did not vanish overnight. Some states clung to the weapon outside the framework of Europe, continuing to argue for its necessity in other settings. That choice, as the story continues, revealed not simply a legal boundary, but a deeper contradiction at the heart of international politics. The double standard, Colonies versus Europe. When delegates at The Hague issued their declaration in 1899, outlawing bullets that expanded or flattened in the human body, the language sounded resolute. Yet the measure applied only in wars between contracting powers, which meant in practice that the rules were confined to conflicts between European states that recognized one another as civilized enemies. In private, British officials noted the distinction. For colonial campaigns, which London classified under a different category, the same ammunition remained available. Thus, the Dum Dum, a weapon judged unacceptable for European battlefields, was still produced in India and could be issued in Africa or Asia when officers deemed it necessary. That pattern was already visible even before the treaty was signed. At the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, the Anglo-Egyptian army under Kitchener carried dum-dum rounds into combat as tens of thousands of Sudanese fighters advanced. Reports from the medical corps described wounds on a scale that shocked even seasoned doctors, and the incident became a focal point in international criticism. Yet Britain defended its choice, claiming that against charging opponents, the standard full metal jacket rounds lacked sufficient effect. This flashpoint set the stage for the Hague debates, and though diplomats accepted the convention, the British Army was not ready to let go entirely of the expanding rounds they had just employed so visibly. The contradiction only sharpened in the years that followed. On the eve of the Second Boer War, London quietly recalled dum-dum ammunition from the field, not because it had lost faith in its effectiveness, but because the government feared the political fallout of being accused of violating the Hague Declaration in a conflict that involved a white settler force. In this case, international perception mattered more than battlefield demands. Yet the recall was not permanent. By 1903, when campaigns in Somaliland pitted British troops against local resistance fighters, expanding bullets reappeared in supplies. Selective enforcement of the rule had become the operating principle. Withdraw them when European opinion was watching closely, reissue them where scrutiny was minimal. Official reasoning for the policy revolved around tactical necessity. British officers argued that colonial combat presented challenges distinct from Europe. Small units faced mass charges across broken terrain. Adversaries could advance rapidly with edged weapons despite being hit. Full metal jacket rounds produced straight wounds, but did not stop determined fighters quickly enough. Dum-dums, by contrast, delivered immediate stopping power, reducing the chance of being overrun. In this framing, gruesome outcomes were not presented as excess cruelty, but as the only means of restoring balance in conditions that lacked the structured lines and artillery of European warfare. The justification also rested on categories of political recognition. Within London's thinking, agreements at The Hague were negotiated to preserve the dignity of warfare between recognized powers. Local resistance movements in colonies were not considered in the same way. Critics, both inside and outside Britain, saw the logic clearly. If wounds from dum-dum bullets were barbaric, they were barbaric no matter who received them. But official statements cushed the rules in terms of civilization. Wars against Europeans demanded restraint. Wars against colonial subjects, officials claimed, could require harsher methods. Contemporary accounts and journals made this distinction explicit, framing the prohibition as protection afforded only to civilized combatants. That double standard revealed itself in both rhetoric and practice. European delegates described expanding bullets as instruments of mutilation, yet in practice, the same ammunition was issued in India and Africa under the cover of necessity. It meant that the definition of unnecessary suffering shifted based on who the victim was. A European soldier struck by a dum-dum represented dishonor. A colonial adversary struck by the same bullet represented order maintained. Observers pointed out what this implied. The protection of humanitarian law did not apply universally, but was filtered through imperial categories of race and status. Soldiers' reports from the northwest frontier of India provide concrete examples of the policy in action. Units tasked with holding small forts often received supplies of expanding rounds. Officers explained in dispatches how charges pressed forward over rocky terrain even after being riddled with fire from full metal jackets. Dum-dums, they said, made the difference between holding a position and being overwhelmed. Local newspapers and military journals framed these outcomes in similar terms. Articles described fanatical rushes and the difficulty of halting them, presenting the expanding bullet as a rational tool for dealing with unconventional foes. The discourse sidestepped the fact that identical wounds had been denounced in European debates as indefensible. Not everyone accepted the logic quietly. Legal experts, members of parliament, and even some army surgeons questioned the double standard. If the bullet was outlawed as cruel in one setting, they asked, how could it be acceptable in another? Their criticism noted that the wound was the same regardless of who received it, and therefore the distinction could only be political. Critics argued that dressing cruelty as necessity revealed the deeper racism of imperial policy, which granted protection to certain enemies and denied it to others. Contemporary reports did not use modern terminology, but they made the point forcefully. The ban was shaped as much by who counted as civilized as by concern for suffering. This selective enforcement created a longer legacy that reached beyond the colonies. It highlighted the fragility of international humanitarian law, which functioned clearly on paper between European powers but was sidestepped whenever imperial needs required. The Dum Dum became a symbol of that gap between principle and practice. It showed how a treaty celebrated as a step toward humane warfare could coexist with exceptions that eroded its universality. Each colonial deployment reminded observers that empires could claim enlightenment in Europe while resorting to different standards abroad. Over time, the controversy gave dum-dums a symbolic role greater than their tactical use. They were remembered not only as expanding bullets, but also as an example of imperial hypocrisy. The fact that they were withdrawn in one war, reissued in another, and manufactured in India, even after 1899, ensured that they lingered in the archive of contradiction. Their memory carried a dual weight: brutal effectiveness on the battlefield and enduring association with the unequal application of humanitarian rules. By the early 20th century, new types of ammunition and shifting tactics reduced their direct presence in arsenals, but the dum-dums' reputation had already been secured. They stood for the violence of empire and the legal inconsistencies that sustained it. Scholars and commentators later pointed to them as an early case study in how international law, though universal in language, often functioned selectively in practice. More than a century on, the dum-dum continues to occupy that uneasy place in history. It serves as an artifact of battlefield design and as a reminder of the assumptions that structured who deserved protection. Critics of empire and of humanitarian law alike have cited the episode to demonstrate how categories of civilization maintained unequal standards of suffering. What mattered was not the effect of the weapon itself, universally devastating, but the identity of those who received it. And yet, while dum-dums were cast out of international battlefields and preserved a reputation for cruelty, their story did not truly end. In an unexpected turn, the design principle behind them would resurface in another context entirely, this time not on distant colonial frontiers, but in the equipment carried daily by authorities closer to home. From dum-dum to hollow points, despite being rejected for warfare more than a century ago, expanding ammunition returned in another guise. In nearly every police force today, officers carry sidearms loaded with hollow-point cartridges, rounds that operate on the same basic principle as the dum-dum. Both expand after impact. Both widen inside the body, inflicting injuries that overwhelm tissue and bone. What seems contradictory at first is that one design became infamous for cruelty in colonial wars, while the other is defended as safer for use in civilian settings. That reversal rests less on what the bullet does physically and more on how its purpose is framed. Modern hollow points look different from the crude colonial versions. Instead of slitting or cutting back the jacket, manufacturers build a cavity into the nose that ensures the projectile expands in a controlled way. Many designs are engineered to retain weight rather than fragment, which keeps the wound localized and avoids small fragments scattering unpredictably. The expansion is deliberate, precise, and repeatable, a feature meant not only to maximize stopping power, but also to prevent bullets from passing through their targets into bystanders or surfaces beyond. Compared with dum-dums hammered into shape in the arsenal at Kolkata, these are highly engineered products with consistent results. Police agencies promote this quality as a public safety advantage. A full metal jacket, the same kind still used in most militaries, often moves through a person with velocity to spare. If that round continues downrange, it might strike another bystander or ricochet in an urban environment. By contrast, a hollow point mushrooms inside the person initially struck, dispersing its energy there rather than beyond. The expansion increases lethality for the target, but reduces the risk to others nearby. For officers working in crowded streets, apartment complexes, or vehicles, this has become the strongest argument for their standard issue. This shift highlights how reputation is molded by legal and social context. In the late 19th century, expanding bullets were denounced as tools of barbarity on battlefields, where both sides were assumed to deserve equal protection under conventions meant to humanize armed conflict. In 21st century policing, the calculation centers on public safety in densely populated environments. If one projectile ends a threat without traveling further, advocates argue that the heavy injury it causes to one person is preferable to the possibility of wounding several others. Law has also framed the divide. The 1899 Hague Declaration did not establish a global prohibition in all settings. It bound only its signatories and only in war between states. It did not address police or civilian activity. This distinction is the reason hollow points became standard in domestic use while retaining a stigma in military context. Later, the International Committee of the Red Cross identified expanding ammunition as generally prohibited under customary law in international armed conflict, though not all states accepted this interpretation. The United States, for example, has consistently argued that in some military and policing roles, hollow points are legitimate. More recently, the Rome Statute Review Conference in Kampala in 2010 expanded war crimes to include the use of such bullets in non-international armed conflict, further complicating the picture. The result is a landscape where legality varies depending on setting, condemned in war between nations, enforceable in some internal conflicts, but embraced at the domestic level by law enforcement worldwide. For medical professionals, however, the results look unchanged. Ballistic tests with gelatin show how hollow points peel open, doubling or tripling their diameter before coming to rest. The cavities they leave resemble what 19th century surgeons described when trying to repair dum-dum wounds: shattered long bones, torn arteries, and soft tissue stripped apart. The immediate stopping effect that makes police use defensible also ensures injuries that resist treatment. Survival depends less on whether a bullet penetrated a vital organ and more on whether emergency care can manage catastrophic local destruction. In practical terms, many administrators emphasize trade-offs. A police officer faces situations in which a missed or through-and-through shot could strike pedestrians or other officers. Using hollow points shifts the burden. They maximize the harm done to the person shot, but reduce the likelihood that harm expands outward to secondary victims. This is why the rounds have been adopted not only by police, but also by civilian gun owners concerned about home defense scenarios. Ammunition that expends itself inside a single body or wall is considered less risky in domestic settings, however severe the wound it inflicts. The comparison to colonial use shows continuity beneath the surface. Dum-Dums were deployed because ordinary full metal jackets did not stop advancing fighters quickly enough. Hollow points are issued because full metal jackets move too far, risking collateral injury. Both are solutions to perceived tactical shortcomings of standard ammunition. Both rely on the principle that a bullet which changes shape on impact serves the shooter's needs more effectively. What differs is the environment and the story told about why the damage is acceptable. Ethical debates have not disappeared. Critics question whether describing hollow points as safer masks the reality of wounds that guarantee permanent disability or death. Some medical organizations argue that the humanitarian logic used in The Hague applies regardless of whether the setting is international war or domestic policing. If a weapon inflicts unnecessary suffering, the context should not excuse it. Proponents respond that no firearm wound is humane and that relative harm must be measured by who else is at risk. Between these positions lies the uneasy compromise that defines hollow points today. A controlled destructive force accepted because it is contained. The result is an irony that never fully goes away. The dum-dum became notorious precisely because it expanded inside the body. Hollow points endure because they do the same thing in a different frame of justification. Factories now produce them in countless varieties, marketed with names that emphasize precision and reliability rather than cruelty. Police manuals describe them as standard equipment. Courts have upheld their use as lawful in civilian context. Yet every expansion recovered in a medical ward or crime scene echoes a controversy first debated more than 120 years ago. In this way, the story of the Dum Dum has not been erased but absorbed. Its design principle resurfaced almost unchanged, shaped by legal interpretation and public expectation rather than physics alone. Where the rule of international conflict confined its place, domestic policing granted it longevity. That tension raises the next question, not about how hollow points are justified at home, but about whether the original prohibition on dum-dums still carries weight in the conflicts of today. Enforcing the ban in 2025. By the early 21st century, the dum-dum ban existed less as a relic of the 19th century and more as a live question of enforcement. In 2025, the prohibition remains part of the framework of international humanitarian law, but the reality of keeping it in place comes down to the same problem that has followed every weapons treaty: who is watching and who actually chooses to comply. The foundation of enforcement rests on treaties and declarations that states have ratified. The 1899 Hague Declaration created the first formal rule, and later agreements and customary international law carried it forward. Once states signed onto the convention, they were expected to bind themselves to the rule, incorporating it into their own military regulations and procurement processes. This is why modern armies issue only full metal jacket rounds for service rifle. Both doctrine and supply systems are designed so that prohibited ammunition never appears in combat inventories. Most major militaries, whether NATO, Russia, or China, already have structures in place to prevent entering the gray area. But rules on paper are one thing, enforcement in practice is another. Small arms ammunition is extremely difficult to monitor compared to heavier categories of weapons. Nuclear or chemical stockpiles can be inspected because they occupy facilities and depend on materials difficult to conceal. Rifle cartridges, by contrast, are cheap, portable, and almost indistinguishable to anyone except a trained analyst. Expanding rounds can be carried in bulk with no obvious markers to a casual observer, and even when a fired bullet is recovered, identifying it with certainty requires careful forensic work. This reality means compliance is effectively self-policed, relying on states to monitor themselves. Violations, when they occur, are rarely spotted in real time. International institutions provide some oversight, but usually indirectly. The United Nations encourages member states to report on their arms procurement and transfers through frameworks like the Arms Trade Treaty. These reporting requirements create, in theory, a degree of visibility into what kinds of ammunition are being moved into conflict zones. If a country were caught shipping expanding rounds under the guise of ordinary contracts, allies and watchdog groups could raise alarm. Yet paperwork and declarations can only go so far. Once the bullets are distributed and fired, detecting their use rests on journalists, human rights investigators, or soldiers on the ground willing to provide evidence. Here the International Criminal Court becomes relevant. The ICC has jurisdiction over war crimes, and the use of expanding bullets in conflict falls within that category where the Rome Statute applies. The 2010 Kampala Amendment expanded this reach further by clarifying that in non-international armed conflicts, the wars fought within state borders, using expanding bullets could be prosecuted as a crime as well. This created a legal pathway that previously had been more ambiguous, but jurisdiction depends on whether a country has ratified the Rome Statute, and several of the world's most powerful militaries have not. The possibility of prosecution exists, but it is constrained by political boundaries. Compliant states are more vulnerable to accountability, while non-members often sit beyond the court's reach. Investigations into alleged violations typically begin with medical evidence or photographic accounts from conflict zones. Doctors in field hospitals may report wounds consistent with expanding bullets. Human rights organizations may collect testimonies and images, and forensic specialists may attempt to match shrapnel or bullet fragments to expanding design. But ammunition is small and often altered when fired. Hollow points, for example, are widely sold on civilian markets, particularly in the United States, making their appearance in a conflict ambiguous. Were they smuggled in by combatants, diverted from police stockpiles, or intentionally supplied by states? Establishing intent, the key to proving a war crime, becomes the most difficult hurdle to clear. This uncertainty explains why many cases stall at the allegation stage. Reports circulate, NGOs highlight suspicious injuries, and journalists suggest rule breaking. Yet unless physical evidence is solid, diplomatic bodies hesitate to act. Even when evidence is strong, enforcement is shaped by politics. A powerful state suspected of providing prohibited ammunition may see little formal consequence, while a weaker rival might encounter larger scrutiny if similar reports appeared. In this way, enforcement continues to function from a basis of selective pressure rather than equal application, just as it did during the colonial era when London drew distinctions between Europe and its overseas campaigns. Still, despite inconsistent enforcement, the prohibition carries weight. States rarely challenge it openly. Even powers that have not ratified the ICC's jurisdiction tend to signal compliance, requiring full metal jackets for their forces and avoiding issuing hollow points to infantry. The symbolic stigma attached to dum-dums has outlasted their short service life. No nation wants the reputational and diplomatic fallout of being accused of deliberately reviving a weapon with more than a century of notoriety. It is precisely because the ammunition has become so stigmatized that most militaries find compliance easy to maintain. Ordinary jacketed rounds deliver adequate performance in modern battle conditions, making the trade-off pragmatic in addition to legal. This does not mean the story is closed. In conflicts on the margins, civil wars, proxy clashes, irregular fighting, expanding ammunition continues to surface. Fighters scavenging weapons often obtain civilian-stocked hollow points, and gun markets make them easy to acquire. Once in circulation, no international mechanism exists to guarantee they will not be used. These stray cases highlight the critical weakness of enforcement. That weapons bans work most consistently on states with the capacity to present themselves as law-abiding, but far less in chaotic environments where oversight is absent. Adding to this complexity is the technology itself. Modern hollow points can resemble non-expanding rounds until dissected, their deforming cavities subtle to the eye until tested in ballistic gelatin. Distinguishing them requires more than confiscation or field inspection. For investigators, this creates a major gap. Even with photographs of wounds, skeptics can argue that high-velocity injuries mimic the same destruction. Without recovered fragments, evidence often falls short of delivering proof capable of moving through courts or UN bodies. Ultimately, the ban's enforcement in 2025 remains a hybrid of law and politics. The prohibition is written into doctrines, recognized broadly as binding, and integrated into export controls. But at ground level, it depends on states choosing to stay inside those lines, on investigators being able to gather evidence in difficult conditions, and on courts having the jurisdiction to act. Violations are possible and sometimes likely, yet the weight of stigma and the risk of diplomatic exposure keep most militaries firmly committed to avoidance. This fragile balance reveals both progress and its limits. International law has made expanding rifle bullets emblematic of what states see as unacceptable violence in war. Few other weapons share such early, explicit prohibition. Yet the challenge of proving use on chaotic battlefields means the rule survives less through inspection and more through the shared calculation that breaking it would cost more than it gained. In practice, the ban is strong enough to shape behavior, but weak enough to allow exceptions when oversight collapses. And that points to the deeper tension that enforcement alone cannot resolve. Law may codify which weapons are off-limits, and diplomacy may reinforce those lines, but on the battlefield, decisions are still made by individuals pulling triggers under pressure. Whether the line between disabling an enemy and inflicting excessive harm can ever be kept clear is a question enforcement bodies cannot answer. Only those making the split-second choices of combat can. And it is here, at the intersection of legality and human judgment, that the real debate pushes onward. Ethics on the trigger. Is it more ethical for a weapon to kill outright or to wound but leave survival as a possibility? That has long been one of the most unsettled questions in military ethics, and it lies directly at the heart of the Dum Dum story. From the very beginning, international humanitarian law tried to balance two principles: military necessity and humaneness. The framers of the 19th century treaties drew on an idea first expressed in the 1868 St. Petersburg Declaration, that weapons should not inflict superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. This principle became the baseline for judging new technologies, and expanding bullets quickly tested its strength. The reasoning behind the principle appeared straightforward at first. A soldier disabled by a wound is removed from the fight but remains alive, with the chance of medical care and eventual recovery. Death, by contrast, ends all outcomes. Humanitarian law leaned toward allowing disabling harms but prohibiting those judged excessively cruel. Yet Dum-Dums blurred that line. Their entire design was built to maximize physical destruction. Crushed tissue, shattered bones, and gaping wounds unlikely to heal without amputation. Survival might occur, but at the cost of catastrophic disfigurement. The distinction between disabling and annihilating suddenly looked unstable. This instability exposed the paradox at the core of so-called humane war. Treaties and declarations tried to distinguish between weapons acceptable for combat and those that inflicted disproportionate suffering. Full metal jacket rounds were permitted largely because their path through the body was relatively narrow and predictable. They might incapacitate, or they might allow survival long enough for treatment. Dum-Dums, by contrast, created injuries so severe that the aftermath resembled a deliberate effort to maim rather than neutralize. The challenge was no longer about whether killing or wounding was preferable. It was about whether there could ever be a clear measure of what counted as humane when both paths meant suffering of a different kind. Soldiers themselves often framed the issue far more bluntly than lawyers or diplomats. From a tactical perspective, effectiveness was the only real criterion. A bullet that stopped an opponent instantly was valued, no matter how terrible the injury. Full metal jackets might allow an enemy to fight on for several crucial seconds. A dum-dum ended the threat immediately. Yet this logic ran headlong into the legal framework. The law sought to restrain cruelty, but in doing so sometimes created definitions that felt abstract to the men bearing arms. A bullet that produced a deep but survivable abdominal wound was considered permissible. A bullet that shattered a leg on impact was not. To many, this appeared arbitrary, even when the intent was to limit suffering. The contradiction sharpened when examined from the surgeon's perspective. Medical staff confronted bodies torn apart in ways that clean rifle punctures never produced. Bones reduced to splinters or soft tissue destroyed beyond repair raised the question: could anyone honestly describe such wounds as contributing to humane warfare? International law said unnecessary suffering was impermissible, but here it was embodied in every patient. That contradiction made Dum-Dums infamous. They turned the abstract language of treaties into tangible suffering that no observer could dismiss. The paradox has never been resolved completely, and it still shapes debates about weapons today. Explosive shells, airdropped bombs, and drone strikes cause injuries far worse than a single expanding bullet, yet Dum-Dums remain singled out by law. Critics argue this demonstrates how symbolic the ban became. By designating one class of small caliber round as off-limits, nations could show that humanitarian principles were influencing war, even as larger and deadlier technologies swept battlefields. The line drawn at Dum-Dums was narrow in practice but large in symbolism. It created a visible standard against which states measured their commitment to restraint. Ethicists point out that this logic never fully answered the central dilemma. If disabling an enemy is acceptable and killing is acceptable, why is maiming through catastrophic wounds unacceptable? One answer points to dignity. A clean shot leaves fewer long-term consequences, whereas a mutilating wound condemns survivors to lives defined by their injury. Another answer highlights proportionality. Inflicting suffering beyond what is required to remove combat effectiveness violates the basic balance intended by humanitarian law. Dum-Dums, by guaranteeing destruction far greater than necessary, crossed that threshold. Still, for soldiers recalling the terror of being overrun by foes unfazed by standard bullets, these distinctions often felt theoretical. Seen from today's vantage point, the debate still circles around the same paradox. Police advocates defend hollow points by arguing they contain collateral harm, even while acknowledging they cause catastrophic injuries to the person struck. Militaries continue to regulate expanding ammunition in wars between states, even though missiles, artillery, and mines kill far more indiscriminately. The Dum-Dum episode endures because it crystallized the clash between restraint and effectiveness so visibly. The moment a weapon defines that contradiction on its own. It becomes a touchstone for broader debates about what counts as cruelty in war. What this reveals is not a simple answer, but a pattern. Every new generation of technology triggers the same cycle. A weapon promises decisive tactical gains, observers denounce its effects as brutal, and rules are drawn to limit it. In this pattern, the Dum Dum was one of the earliest flashpoints. It forced diplomats, soldiers, and surgeons alike to recognize that the distinction between permissible and excessive suffering is neither clear nor permanent. It shifts with context, perspective, and what nations are willing to accept as civilized conduct. That is why the Dum Dum remains a central case study in classrooms and policy manuals today. It is less about the bullet itself, long since obsolete in military arsenals, and more about the dilemma it symbolizes. The clash between necessity and humanity, legality and practicality, has not disappeared. Each new development in war technology inherits the same questions, and the Dum Dum's name continues to surface whenever people ask how far science and strategy should be allowed to redefine the boundaries of acceptable violence. For many, its legacy is not the weapon's short life in arsenals, but the contradiction it left behind. A small-caliber round that forced the world to admit that even in regulated war, human suffering could never be neatly contained. And in a curious twist, what secured its place in cultural memory was not only its gruesome effect, but also the dissonance between its brutal legacy and its almost playful name. That contrast, lethal reality paired with an oddly harmless label, shaped how the weapon was remembered and ensured it lingered in public imagination for decades afterward. The bullet with a comic book name. How does one of the most destructive bullets in military history end up with a name that sounds like a joke? The term Dum Dum hardly calls to mind battlefields or diplomatic confrontations. To many people, it sounds closer to a lollipop brand, a playground insult, or the comic relief sidekick in a Saturday matinee. And yet, this light, almost slapstick label became attached to one of the most condemned munitions of modern time. The origins of the name are simple. It came from the Dum Dum arsenal outside Calcutta, the colonial factory where engineers reshaped the .303 cartridge to deliver far more destructive results. That accidental borrowing of place name into history explains why such lethal rounds ended up with a word that feels oddly cartoonish. The combination, a silly sound tied to a gruesome legacy, helped the bullet persist in cultural memory long after its military service ended. Popular culture latched onto Dum Dum less because people knew its technical background and more because the word itself was irresistible. In English, it already existed as a harmless taunt, calling someone a dum-dum as shorthand for foolish or slow. That everyday slang overlapped perfectly with the reputation of the ammunition, offering an easy double meaning. Writers, scriptwriters, and musicians could slip it in for whimsy, mockery, or menace, depending on the context. Even when no one in the audience knew about treaties or arsenals in India, the word carried an echo, silly on the surface, but with a shadow of violence underneath it. That tension made the word sticky, a recurring, ironic reference that creators kept revisiting. Film and television provided early examples of this quiet repurposing. On one level, Dum Dum worked as a simple insult tossed at hapless villains. For those who did catch the historical allusion, it carried a wink towards something far less funny, bullets long condemned as cruel. This double register, comedy for some, dark reference for others, gave the term staying power on screen. Comics followed suit. Marvel's Dum Dum Dugan, the cigar-chewing sergeant in the Howling Commandos, was drawn as a loyal, tough companion with no menace attached to his name. The sound of it was funny enough to work across panels, yet it also pulled faintly on a hidden thread that tied the character's moniker back to a much harsher past. In music and street slang, Dum Dum took on new shades. The word slid into lyrics and conversation as shorthand for a gun, a bullet, or just danger in general. Sometimes the references were lighthearted, sometimes they leaned into menace. In either case, they relied on the word's sharp, repetitive rhythm. The origins were often forgotten, but the echo remained. Even when used casually in rap verses or neighborhood slang, the word kept one foot in its violent origin. It became a term as punchy as gunfire itself, while never straying too far from association with weapons, whether the speaker understood the colonial backstory or not. That contrast remains striking. How can a munition once denounced for its mutilating effects carry syllables that could belong in a nursery rhyme? It is exactly that mismatch that secured its legendary quality. Compare it to other banned weapons. Poison gas or landmine sound heavy, direct, and dreadful. They summon images of horror but no humor. Dum Dum, by contrast, arrived almost like a toy's name, which paradoxically made headlines memorable when 19th and early 20th century newspapers covered debates at The Hague. Its bounce on the tongue ensured the ban was not only reported but remembered. That accidental branding did far more than ordnance officials ever intended. Unlike terms carefully crafted for propaganda, the Dum Dum name was unplanned. It was simply shorthand for the arsenal that produced it, a depot outside Calcutta that became a footnote in empire and a fixture in controversy. Had it been born at a workshop with a drab title, the bullet might have survived only in catalogue numbers. Instead, Dum Dum was short, strange, and unforgettable, locking itself into public memory by sheer accident of geography. Each new retelling of the weapon's story reinforced the word, until the name often stood larger than the actual technical details of the round behind it. Even in military training, the name carries an awkward resonance. Recruits learning about banned ammunition still startle at the term. Laughter often comes first, cracked by the comic sound of the syllables, followed by discomfort as they learn what the bullet actually did. That moment of dissonance captures why the word persists. It forces memory, holding attention far more firmly than the dry term expanding bullet ever could. The oddity of the name serves as a gateway into the grim lesson underneath, that the shape of a projectile could matter enough to transform battlefield ethics and international law. Outside barracks and classrooms, ordinary cultural life kept repeating the name as part of trivia and casual conversation. People enjoyed pointing out the irony that something with such a whimsical sound marked one of the earliest efforts to codify humanitarian limits on weapons. The story was almost ready-made for anecdotes, invites, or pub quizzes. The very ease with which it spread ensured it was never fully forgotten. The humor surrounding the sound didn't remove the horror of its legacy, but it wrapped it in a format easy to share. In that form, the name circulated to audiences who had little interest in military history yet could still carry away the contrast. Compared with other prohibited munitions, Dum Dums unquestionably achieved a broader cultural imprint. Yet it is important not to overstate. They never rose to the status of global icons recognizable in every household. Instead, they became a recurring, ironic reference across media, an inside joke in film dialogue, the name of a comic book soldier, a casual shorthand in music or slang. That half-remembered presence in culture gave them a peculiar prominence, far more than their brief battlefield use might have suggested. History supplied the notoriety, language supplied the memorability, and together they kept the bullet alive in the margins of popular memory. The weapon's actual deployment was fleeting. It was formally banned before the 20th century entered full stride. But the word survived in speech and writing, long outliving the empire that produced it. The combination of grim reputation and offbeat name created a symbolic resonance that has continued ever since. It was never only about the bullet itself, but about the way language carried its story, allowing it to pass from arsenals and treaties into comics, songs, classrooms, and jokes. And in that passage, a second legacy was written. Dum Dums came to illustrate how branding, intentional or accidental, can shape public memory as much as battlefield fact. Their wounds were horrific, their history brief, but their name ensured the controversy endured, woven into culture as both gag and warning. That's why more than a century later, the term still circulates, faintly humorous yet always edged with violence. Few other banned weapons have managed to leave behind that kind of cultural double life. It all returns to the same jarring gap. A name that bounces like a comic punchline attached to a weapon remembered for shattered limbs and irremediable suffering. The gap between sound and substance is what keeps people bringing it up, as trivia, as metaphor, as warning. In the end, Dum Dum remains one of the clearest cases of how words keep history alive while softening none of its grim reality. And while its name continues to echo in culture, its deeper legacy lies elsewhere. In the fact that this small bullet, with its disarming label, still shadows discussions about war, restraint, and the boundaries of brutality, long after the arsenal that forged it vanished from the map. The legacy that won't die. The legacy of the Dum Dum Bullet rests not in the weapon's presence on today's battlefields, but in the fact that its prohibition still shapes international law and military ethics. The empire that produced it no longer exists, its depots and factories either dismantled or repurposed, yet the debates it ignited remain part of modern institution. Rules against expanding rifle ammunition, first formalized more than a century ago, continue to stand as a marker of what war is supposed to exclude. In this sense, the bullet has endured not through use, but through the architecture of law. The Hague decision had been intended as closure. Instead, it marked the beginning of an argument that still reappears whenever new weapons are introduced. The Dum Dum occupies a singular place in the legal history of armed conflict. When delegates in The Hague placed restrictions on expanding bullets, they reinforced an idea first broached in the 1868 St. Petersburg Declaration. That weapon design itself could violate humanitarian principles. Until then, treaties largely dictated tactics: no chemical shells, no explosive rifle rounds under a certain weight, rules about treatment of prisoners. By placing the focus squarely on how a bullet was engineered, the Hague Declaration and the controversy that preceded it embedded the idea that the physical design of a weapon could be regulated. That principle has since become a cornerstone of humanitarian law. From that precedent, later restrictions drew strength. When incendiary weapons designed to burn across wide areas were placed under international scrutiny, lawmakers could point back to the Dum Dum debate. When military lasers engineered to blind were prohibited in the late 20th century, they too were justified in the language inherited from St. Petersburg and The Hague. Weapons that caused unnecessary suffering or whose design was inherently cruel could be ruled impermissible. The Dum Dum's notoriety, therefore, echoed beyond its short operational use and became part of a lineage that gave later treaties their legitimacy. The irony is that those who created the Dum Dum did not anticipate any of this. At the arsenal near Calcutta, British ordnance officers in the 1890s had a narrow purpose: make a standard-issue rifle round stop enemies more effectively in colonial wars. They were not inventing a new moral battleground or setting up legal arguments for the next century. Yet their small modification, slicing away part of the copper jacket to expose soft lead beneath, sparked arguments that still appear in law schools and military ethics courses today. The empire that used the round has passed into history, but the debates sparked by its design have lasted longer than any empire's borders. Survival in memory comes from relevance, not nostalgia. The Dum Dum retains attention because the same questions it raised continue to trouble military designers. How can a bullet incapacitate reliably without inflicting injuries judged excessive? Armies want effective stopping power, but know they must operate inside the limits of humanitarian law. This produces a cycle of innovation focused on balancing utility and restraint, experimenting with novel propellants, shaping bullets for aerodynamic efficiency, or adjusting case design to achieve stability on impact without overstepping into legally prohibited expansion. The dilemma is not solved, it is managed. Dum Dums made the dilemma impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, police and civilian markets sidestepped that constraint altogether by adopting hollow-point ammunition. These modern companions to the Dum Dum work through the same expanding principle, but carry a different legal framing. Law enforcement emphasizes the safety argument. Expansion prevents a bullet from passing through a body into bystanders or deflecting uncontrollably in urban space. For militaries, that same logic cannot supersede the legal prohibition against inhumane injury on the battlefield. This split creates a strange irony. Rounds condemned in international settings appear on practice ranges for police cadets. Every time these cadets learn about hollow points in training while also studying the Hague ban, the contradiction resurfaces, keeping the Dum Dum alive as a reference point. The persistence of Dum Dums in global consciousness has less to do with scale of use than with symbolic weight. Consider the contrast. Artillery barrages and machine guns killed millions in the 20th century, yet are not stigmatized in the same way. Dum Dums were singled out early, identified as examples of what ought to be left outside civilized warfare. That singling out gave them a permanent place as an example of restraint. They became shorthand for the moral claim that some designs are simply too destructive to legitimize. From that point forward, discussions of new treaties, whether about cluster bombs or chemical agents, could draw a line back to the Dum Dum case as precedent. Because of this symbolic function, Dum Dums remain active in education. Military academies teach cadets about the technical differences between full metal jacket and expanding rounds, using grisly case reports from colonial campaigns to underline why a prohibition was enacted. International law courses walk students through how the ban represents a moral threshold, not simply outlawing a tactic, but branding a class of design as unacceptable in itself. In these settings, dum-dums are not relics. They are case studies still shaping how future leaders think about limits in war. The bullet's continued presence in discourse also shows how slim the line is between acceptable and prohibited. Engineers work at the edge of legality, experimenting with designs that fragment but are said not to expand, or rounds that deliver high-energy transfer without breaching prohibitions. Lawyers then carry arguments into courtrooms or treaty conferences, parsing language set down in 1899. Each cycle repeats the same dynamic. Designers stretch performance, rules push back, ethicists remind both sides where history has drawn lines. Dum-dums remain the reference, the reminder of why those lines were drawn in the first place. The contradiction of their original use also continues to resonate. Britain's selective enforcement, banning dum-dums in European conflicts but issuing them in colonial wars, remains a touchstone in debates about credibility. Every time new restrictions are discussed, critics bring up that example to question whether bans can be applied equally. Rules that collapse into exceptions damage both trust and enforcement. By remembering the dum-dum double standard, policymakers are reminded of what happens when law claims universality, but practice falls into selective use. In this way, even hypocrisy became part of the weapon's legacy. The cultural afterlife of dum-dums reinforces their dual identity. Trivia columns retell the story of a bullet with a name closer to candy than cruelty. Comics and films play with the term as either comic relief or dark illusion, blending humor with unease. These pop culture references keep the story circulating far beyond legal circles, ensuring the bullet remains known to audiences who never study international law. Its place in culture cements the contradiction. A fleeting weapon that became a permanent moral symbol. What stands out today is the contrast between the short-lived ammunition itself and the staying power of the debates it created. Nations that once fought over it no longer exist in the same form, and yet references to dum-dums appear in treaties, classrooms, and culture. This shows that the bullet's afterlife is legal precedent and a recurring ethical touchstone, not operational longevity. It is unusual for one small-caliber round to serve as both historical lesson and living standard. But dum-dums occupy that role without question. Taken as a whole, the dum-dums' legacy is unsettling. It revealed the fragility of the idea that war could be humane, even as treaties tried to define what that might look like. It established early that the design of weapons could be restricted by law, but exposure to double standards eroded confidence in universal principles. It provided grounds for stigmatizing future technologies, while showing how selective enforcement always risked turning moral resolve into political posturing. The questions raised in the 1890s still appear in modern negotiations, reminding each generation that innovation and humanitarian limits remain in tension. The relevance, then, is not limited to history. The dum-dum remains invoked whenever nations confront new weapons, whenever law tries to anticipate how innovation might cross ethical lines. Its prohibition has become a symbol that lingers in debates long after the round itself disappeared from use. In that persistence lies the bullet's true weight, its ability to embody unresolved contradictions about necessity, cruelty, and restraint. And yet, the deeper irony is this. For a weapon that existed only briefly, its influence continues to steer conversations on arms control, law, and morality. That lasting influence sets the stage for one final consideration: what the dum-dum ultimately tells us about the relationship between technological change and the fragile rules we use to contain it. For a weapon that saw such a short life in the field, the dum-dum bullet left behind an unusually long shadow. Its prohibition helped entrench the idea that a weapon could be judged cruel not through its intent, but through its very design, a principle carried forward from the St. Petersburg Declaration to the Hague and then into modern humanitarian law. That enduring lesson reshaped how nations think about regulating technology itself, not just how it is used. The empire that once produced dum-dums collapsed long ago, but the arguments they sparked remain active in classrooms, treaties, and even police armories. Remember, The Dum Dum story shows how technology, law, and ethics collide, and why even small inventions can set off big moral debates. What do you think? Should weapons be judged by their design or by the way they're used? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this mix of history and ethics interesting, consider subscribing for more stories that explore how the past shapes the present.